We've been talking about this one for a while. One of the most commonly asked questions on the stream over the last month or so. And it's just about what dungeons do we think we're going to see in the pool for Shadowlands Season 2. I think typically the question is kind of interfaced in what do I want to see? But I also want to talk about what I think we'll see because I don't know, as you know, I don't normally try to get too invested in which dungeons we're doing. You got to do them all. But right out of the gate, if you guys aren't aware, they've completely changed up how they're doing dungeons in Dragonflight. If somehow you aren't aware of that, what they did was they did 8 dungeons for Dragonflight launch, and then only 4 of them have been in the Mythic Plus pool in season 1. I do think that did not work. I have a lot of videos on this now. This is really not working if you ask me, but it's not really because of those dungeons. It's also because of the other dungeons, the 4 that are coming from the past. So they're now doing those 4 and then 4 from the past. So presumably chalk here, we have the 4 dungeons we hadn't gotten already in season 1 going to be in season 2. That should be Uldaman, Halls of Infusion, Brackenhide Hollow, and whatever the 4th dungeon is. I have absolutely no idea. I can't remember what it's called. But anyway, no, yeah, those 4, is there a chance that one of them doesn't show up? Is there some weird chance here that they don't do it exactly as we expected, right? Because, I think they even said that that's what they're doing, but the question there is what do they do for season 3 and 4? Is there going to be a mega dungeon? When is that going to get slotted in? That's kind of the thing that makes me doubt it a little bit. But I think in reality, it's just going to be the 4 that we don't have currently. And, I do think in general, yeah, Neltharius, that's the other dungeon. I do think in general these dungeons are going to be a lot harder than people expect them to be. If I look at the slice of 4 from season 1 versus the slice of 4 from season 2 seems way, 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 way harder. Halls of Infusion, I think, is probably going to go down as the hardest Mythic Plus ever. Now, this is going to be contingent upon tuning, as always. We said this a lot about dungeons in the past, and they don't end up being that hard because they're tuned differently. And I actually said this about Shadow Moon Barrier Ground because of the way it played out in the WAD version. So it's all about tuning. It's all about the timer. The thing that I think about that dungeon the most, though, is it's got very complicated bosses. It's got a lot of trap mechanics on trash, instant one shots if you don't interrupt. Those frog things, just one shotting you. These kind of things are probably going to kill a lot of people, potentially break a lot of keys. And most importantly, it's got a lot of these traps in situations where you just can't get back to the dungeon portion very easily. There's a bit of a famous problem with this dungeon where the checkpoint is really absurd and it's a really large dungeon. You'll probably find the same issue with some of the other dungeons, well, like Neltharius. Those bosses are really challenging, and even trying to do them on heroic, people just don't do them well. That Mammoth boss, I think, is probably the most unfair Mythic Plus boss I've seen in this expansion. It's just gonna be a monster of a tyrannical fight, and I do think that last boss is gonna be the same problem as well because it's got a really big DPS uptime problem. People are going to greed on it, especially if it's a boss we end up lusting on, and they're just not going to do that coin mechanic properly. So we'll see what happens there. Obviously, Uldaman, you could say the same thing about. I think honestly, Brackenhide is going to be the one that people like the most. Coming out of the Mythic Zero version of it, they didn't like it because it was the hardest of the Mythic Zeros, but it did get a bunch of nerfs even in the Mythic Zero version. And I think realistically, people just didn't know how to handle it because there's actually a bunch of mechanics in the dungeon that you can do to potentially make it easier. But I think the reason people are going to like it the most is because the routing in there is going to be very flexible. And people love that about dungeons. If you look at dungeons from BFA and stuff, people really fondly remember that, where there's tons of different options. You can go 250% count and you just choose which ones you want to take. So that being said, what 4 do I think will come to accompany them? So if we look at the current trend, we have 2 Legion dungeons, 1 Mop dungeon, and 1 WAD dungeon. We have no BFA dungeon currently and no Shadowlands dungeon. Presumably that will continue. I do not think there will be a Shadowlands dungeon, and frankly, I probably don't expect a BFA dungeon either. Although I would really advocate for them to do at least one, because I have to say right now, my least favorite part about season 1 is the fact that the Mop and WAD dungeons, they just don't work. I mean, as much as I, whatever, Shadow Moon Battleground, super easy key. I think it's really breaking a lot of the situations here. They had to change the way score was delivered because they know Shadow Moon Battleground is just a double upgrade key. Now, to be fair, this isn't the first time we've had that. We did have that with Junkyard as well, 2 times now, back in BFA and then again at the end of Shadowlands. But When it's the first season of an expansion, that's not great. And it's kind of, yeah, it's just really breaking the rules of the game. And so I don't want to see that again. And I don't know if they cannot do that because these mob and wad dungeons, they're just not made right. Like they don't have the mechanical density that the newer dungeons would have. So I think they really should just stop trying to do those old dungeons. It was really the same thing. Iron Docks was just like a mess, and then Grimrail Depot was a joke. Like they can't seem to get them even. They can't seem to get them equal. Do you guys care about that? I don't know if I really do. Like I said, especially playing more like a casually approach to these dungeons nowadays. I'm not taking them as serious. I mean, whatever. Hey, you know what? It's fine. But I do think it sets a bad precedent. It also puts this like unrealistic expectation on groups forming for those dungeons because everybody expects them to be so easy. So it almost like kind of makes them harder because now you're putting a lot more pressure on them being easy. But anyway, I do think that they will probably stick with one WAD, one Legion, or one mob dungeon. And I think the one that we've heard talked about a lot now is actually the Shadowpan Monastery. Okay. For some reason, when they were talking about Dragonflight, Mythic Plus and Dragonflight, they mentioned Shadowpan Monastery a bunch of times. Like it was just straight up talked about in interviews from like before we even knew what the current season 1 dungeons were going to be. And I think that tells you that they're working on it. And I wouldn't be surprised at all if they were working on the 16 dungeons we saw in season 1 and 2 simultaneously, because of course the 8 Dragonflight dungeons were all worked on simultaneously. So I wouldn't be surprised if they were preparing all of these dungeons at the same time. So my vote is going to be for Mob. Is that the dungeon I want to see? No, absolutely not. Like I said, I really don't want to see another Mob dungeon. But if we absolutely had to pick one, yeah, honestly, probably Jade Temple would have been the one that I would have liked to see. We got that in season 1. At this point, Scholomance was a really fun dungeon. The Scarlet dungeons were fun. It's kind of interesting because the Scarlet dungeons are getting, well, they're not getting anything, but there's like this weird Scarlet, like I don't even know, like transmog or something being data mined in 10.0.7. There's been a lot of talk about Scarlet stuff, so who knows? But yeah, maybe they'll do one of those. I think that would be kind of weird, to be honest. Like if you didn't play MOP, it was 9 dungeons and 3 of them were not actually in Pandaria, Scholomance, and then 2 of the Scarlet dungeons were remade as well. So I don't know. I'm liking WAD though. I would love to see Skyreach. I think Skyreach would be a much, much, much better dungeon for Mythic Plus. It was a way like it was complicated. That dungeon had a lot more mechanics going on. The bosses were more mechanically dense. There was a lot more trickery that you can do. It wasn't as broken as Shadow Moon Burial Ground, but again, it's all going to be contingent on where you fall in terms of the tuning of these things. So that would be my pick. Do we have like I don't know if they've talked about any WAD dungeons. Like, do we expect one? That would be the one I would want to see. So we'd say Skyreach and maybe Scholomance, but really I would just prefer to see no MOP dungeon. J Temple was like the only one, and they had to completely redesign it. So in terms of Legion dungeons, like I just don't really want to pick 2 Legion dungeons again. I really don't. But if I had to pick one, I definitely would pick Neltharius, or Nathan's Lair. What do they call it? Neltharian's Lair, right? Yeah, that's the one. I think that would actually be a really cool idea here because it would make a lot of sense with Dragonflight. Like it's got a bit of a thematic element to it alongside Neltharius, which is the dungeon from Dragonflight. Really good at using words to describe things. So that would be a good idea. I think that was a fun one. It's one of my favorite dungeons ever for Mythic Plus. Another big one I always liked was Darkheart Thicket. I really think Darkheart Thicket would fit in well today. It's got a lot of similarities to Halls of Valor and how it played out, and it's a shorter dungeon, more straightforward dungeon. Maybe they adjust count again. Maybe they do something with some of those areas that people hated, but what is that you hold there, Druid? Never gonna forget that. Very cheesy voice acting in that dungeon, but that was always like my favorite dungeon to do in Legion because of how soloable and how like kind of badass Blood Death Knight felt in that dungeon. But I do think they should not do 2 Legion dungeons. I would really like to see 1 BFA dungeon, and in that pick, I would like to see Motherlode. Motherlode is definitely my favorite dungeon from the BFA era. BFA was plagued with 2 really bad dungeons. Maybe I could even say maybe even 3 really bad dungeons. So I think as long as we just don't see Toldagor, Siege of Bralis, or maybe even King's Rest again, I'd be very, very happy no matter what dungeons we give. So yeah, just wanted to make this short little video. People have been asking me this a ton. and it's probably only going to continue to ramp up. I think there's a time where you can make this video too early, and there's a time when you can make it too late. I feel like we're right in the middle here. So let me know what you guys think. I'd love to hear your 8. I think we're going to have to assume that the 4 are definitely in stone from Dragonflight. So just go ahead and skip that if you don't want, and just give what 4 you'd like to see. And maybe, try to say, like, do we think we'll see them? Like, if you're picking like 4 Shadowlands dungeons, we're not going to see that, right? But, I think there's a time for BFA dungeons to be considered. Freehold, Motherlode, maybe some other options. Underrot, I think, was a very good dungeon. Screndy Snot, however you guys say it nowadays. So let me know what you guys think. I'd love to hear this discussion. It's been a common topic. So I'm excited for season 2, man. I really am, because I do think we're going to see a lot about what this process is going to look like moving forward. And then season 3, this is going to be a big one. I cannot wait to see what the future holds for all this.